everyone. So excited to have people in this wonderful breakout session where we're going to be talking about rising to the challenge, providing clear communications in today's media landscape. My name is Jessica Kellner. I'm going to be the moderator. Just a brief introduction of myself. I have been working in communications with American Promise for past over 3 years, helping uplift the stories of people across America working toward a constitutional amendment around money and politics. I'm also the co-founder of Bark Media. We're a communications strategy firm that works on impact businesses and nonprofits, supporting movements that are improving our world. I'm very happy to be joined by our wonderful panelists. Brief introductions there. We have Ravel. She is the former chair of the Federal Election Commission. She is also the director of MapLight's Digital Deception Project, a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and has run for Senate in California. So thank you, Anne, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Next up, we've got Tim Marema. He is an editor at the daily Yonder, which is an online publication focused on rural people, places, and issues. He's also a founding member of the Center for Rural Strategies, and he's based just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. Hi, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
And then connecting the two, we have John Gable. He's a longtime tech professional. He was a team lead for Netscape Navigator, comes from Kentucky, but is now in California. So that's the connecting piece. And he's the founder and CEO of All Sides Media, which focuses on bias, polarization in the media, and how technology impacts that. So thank you, John. Hi.
That's a nice intro. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so excited to be talking with all of you. So I think let's just jump right into our conversation here. I'd like to start by just talking about disinformation. I know all of you working in media and technology and all the places that you work are familiar with disinformation, as are all of us in America. It's become a huge focal point in American politics. It's become a part of our society, frankly. What is disinformation? Why is it driving hyperpartisanship? And I'd love to just hear from each of you, your take on this. And we'll start with you, if you can talk about, digital deception is something you're obviously working on. What does that mean? What does it mean for all of us?
Right. Well, I wanted to name it digital deception because I started working on this when I was at the Federal Election Commission, and I realized that campaigning and politics was going to the internet, and that there was so many things that were false and that were intended to influence the election and by those falsehoods. And that's what we saw and that was in 2014 when I was looking at these issues. And what I ultimately realized, and what we now know, is that disinformation has ballooned so that a lot of it comes from political figures or others who are influencers on social media. And it gets spread in an incredibly fast way, both organically, that is, people spread it to their friends and others, but also there are a lot of other ways that it gets spread, as well as targeted and micro-targeted to individuals based on their biases. And as a result, we have seen, because what gets spread and what people like to get on the internet in particular is the most inflammatory, most vitriolic kind of information, that is what they tend to spread. And they don't know the truth of it, they just spread it. And I think that a really good example of this, and when I read this a couple of weeks ago, I was stunned. The Facebook and others also use their algorithms, and I know John's going to talk a little bit about this, but they use their algorithms to get people of similar groups or similar ideologies to recommend things to them. And recently, a member of the extremist group that was planning to kill Michigan Governor Whitmer, said that he actually joined that group because he was on Facebook and he was a supporter of the Second Amendment. And as a result of that, Facebook recommended to him that he join that extremist group, and he did. And that is how easy this manipulation on the internet has been able to be used as a measure of sowing discord and chaos. And when it's spread so widely, even people who are of good intent, they doubt the integrity of the information that they have generally. And because of that, one of my real concerns about it, because I'm most concerned about the political and democratic impact of all of this, people have lost trust in government and institutions because of that. And ultimately, that lack of trust causes generalized anger and tribalism. And that's what we've seen here, where people absolutely, and I know you might want to talk about this otherwise, but I think it's really a problem as well about this has polarized people. And it's not just about policy differences. It's really about just antipathy and anger about the other. And that is a huge problem for our democracy and has led, as we know, to incitement of violence in support of political aims. And one thing that a lot of people don't talk about, and I know you probably, I may have my time up, but things like discussions of vaccines and the coronavirus, people don't realize that, but those discussions are political. At heart, they are meant to polarize people politically.
Yeah. Well, many things Anne just said I know are also top concerns of yours, John, and would love to hear your take on it too. I know you've looked a lot at the algorithms and tribalism and how all of these bubbles are human nature and algorithms sort of work together to divide us. Love to hear some of your reactions to what Anne just said.
Yeah, I actually think it's even more fundamental than disinformation. 24 years ago, in January, I disturbed by the fact that I say 24 years ago about anything I did, but 24 years ago, I gave a little speech saying how I thought the internet, for all the wonderful things it would do for us, and this was early when we're trying to figure out what the internet would be like, I thought it would also do some negative things. I thought it would also train us to discriminate against each other in new ways. I thought it would lead to more stereotypical thinking and thinking in terms of metaphor. So that now we see you're a friend of a friend, so you must be okay, or that kind of thinking. And in the ways I thought it would go bad, it went much worse. In ways I never imagined it would go bad, it got worse. The thing that was a little bit more what I was concerned about was the filter bubbles. And I think we need to understand what that really does. So when you actually talk to academics who've studied people's behavior, when any individual, me or any other individuals, just around people just like me, and only hear ideas and opinions that I agree with, two things happen. One thing is that we become much more extreme in everything we believe. So I didn't just believe this, I believe it in a much more extreme way. The other thing that happens is that I become much less open to any or tolerant of any other person or any other idea. And that's kind of fundamentally what's happening with the internet, is these filter bubbles. And I think that's a more dramatic shift. It's more like the printing press. When the printing press first happened, we all think of the Enlightenment or all these wonderful things about books, but we forget that the first 100 years, it was utter chaos. When books were being distributed that had things that were false in it, that had a lot of pornography, that had a lot of things that were challenging establishment. All this is just like the internet. And what happened is that people challenged the establishment. The establishment fought back. In the first 100 years or so, when books got to that size, they could move around, there was a lot of chaos. But after about 100 years, depending on how you count, a couple of things happened. People reading the books, oh, by the way, one thing I love to point out is they also wrote about how people were concerned everybody's heads would be in their books and not interacting with each other when books started. But so what happened is that people began to understand that if I read something that wasn't necessarily true, or if I read something inflammatory, upsetting, I didn't necessarily need to go attack somebody. In other words, what we might call news literacy or media literacy. People learn how to use that new technology in their lives. We also created new technology back then, established credible publishers, as well as libraries. I think we need to do the same thing now. We need a sense of news literacy and media literacy so people can understand how to handle all of this social media and completely disinformation and other information, understand how to fight through all that, because that's not going to stop. We can do things to work on it, but I don't think we'll ever be able to stop it.
Yeah.
And we need technologies to help us get through that. And so I always say, like at all sides, we think we're a part of the solution, but our goal is to take that 100 years of chaos and get it down to about 20. So then we can get to a new enlightenment, if you will, where the internet really drives us in better relationships and better understanding so we can make better decisions. That's what all of us who were working the internet early on, that's what we dreamt about. And that's what I think is still possible. The internet's moving, the technology's changing, but it is a tough battle because there's so much money and so much ability to manipulate people. This is not something I had predicted when I was thinking 24 years ago. I didn't fathom this, but the power to manipulate people to buy or click or to feel or act or vote a certain way is at such a different level today than it's ever been in human history that I can fathom, that it's a new problem. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing, to kind of give people the power back to individual people. Because I'm not sure if the problem is actually, as Anne said, the lack of trust in institutions, and it depends on what you call institutions, but lack of trustworthiness, because they're all using to manipulate. So both problems go together, and you can't just talk about one and not the other. There's both of them are happening, and I think we're in a historical time, as big as the printing press change in society, that we need to grab onto to help us move to a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a wonderful way of putting it. Tim, I want to talk with you. Both Anne and John touched on this sort of tribalism and a lack of, very black and white thinking, the filter bubbles, and especially in rural America. I would love to hear your perspective on how that plays out in terms of, viewing rural America as this monolithic thing that all has one point of view, and how it plays out. Before this, we were talking some about anger toward rural America as a whole, and how this whole situation of polarization plays out from your perspective.
That's a great question, and the comments of the other panelists are so sharp. If I can add just a little bit about the rural perspective to any of that, part of it would be that rural America went through kind of what we're going through now with the collapse of mainstream media. We really experienced that with the Great Recession around 2008. Media pulled back their regional reporters, major newspapers pulled back. TV broadcasters pulled their news people out of the bureaus, and essentially areas that had daily circulation. I'm familiar with Eastern Kentucky with the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Lexington Herald-Leader suddenly had nothing in terms of a regional daily newspaper. And so those communities, and that's just one example, are left with an information void. And it's kind of an information market failure. And you're left with, nature abhors a vacuum. Something is going to move into that space. And we've seen kind of the angry talk radio move into some of it. But the internet has created an opportunity for that type of information in rural America that just didn't exist widely before. And with no or little statewide information to compare your information to, it becomes hard to ground truth much. And so all of the problems that Ann and John are describing in urban areas with disinformation and distortion are that times 3 in rural areas, I would say. And at the national level and how rural is represented, there really is kind of a monolithic view. There's been some great rural reporting on rural America by coastal media. And it really has raised awareness of economic, social, cultural issues occurring in rural America. But the thing I see missing there is that it is, the New York Times is the hometown newspaper of Manhattan. And so that's the audience, and that's who you're writing for. And even if they reach a national or international audience, that's kind of what that conversation is directed at. It's not about rural, it's about rural people, not to rural people. And that's primarily what we see at the national level. It doesn't mean it's not good reporting, but it does mean that the perspective of rural people are not necessarily reflected in that in ways that resonate in rural America. And that contributes to this divisiveness and the feeling like, oh, they don't understand. And I can't trust that outlet. So those are just a couple thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, that's great, Tim. And I definitely want to touch more on people telling their own stories as we go forward. So I'm going to talk about that again. But I did want to remind everyone watching that we're going to have a Q&A with these wonderful panelists toward the end. We'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. So please submit your questions if you would like to ask something of the panelists. So briefly, I just want to talk, this has all been wonderful perspective, and I do want to move us towards sort of what we have seen working and the solutions. But I want to just talk a little bit about money in politics. We're all talking about all of the money and media and polarization, but how does the amount of money in politics play into this? I was talking to Jeff Clements the other day, the president of American Promise, and he said something I thought was a quote he'd heard that somebody said, there was $14 billion spent in 2020 with the purpose of making Americans angry, fearful, divided, and misinformed. Well, if you spend $14 billion with that goal, you're probably going to succeed. So how, from your perspective, does the totally unlimited amount of money and unknown money in the political system play into this situation? Whoever wants, Ann, do you want to start again?
I would love to jump in. This is something I'm incredibly passionate about. So I actually heard Jeff is way underestimating the amount of money. I actually heard that in the 2020 election, $29 billion was spent by independent expenditure groups, which, as most people recognize, these are super PACs. They're often funded by other organizations, 501c4s or LLCs, and as a result, you never really know who's giving that money. So that's where a lot of the money comes from, even though everybody is, also angry about the very wealthy, who also give a lot of money. And there's no question that the money in politics and the fact that we don't have transparency of money in politics has influenced the problem that we're seeing with disinformation, not just in the materials, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but also because they do a lot of advertising on the internet as well. And a lot of what is done is spread of misinformation, both on local TV ads, and you still don't know who's behind it often, as well as all those materials that people give out, the flyers and the like, and as well as the internet. And often that information is false, completely false, or at least misleading. toxic and really divisive advertising. And the people who have paid for it aren't identified as individuals, and therefore there's really no accountability for that vitriol. And it's extremely difficult for candidates to be able to change the narrative, because there too is a place that people don't know enough about the reality, and so they believe that stuff that they see on TV and other places. And it's often personal attacks and lies about candidates' voting records, etc. But what it does is, and it does add to that that division, because there can't be debate about issues. Nobody cares about the issues. They just care about these vitriolic things that are now put on those commercials. And I could say, you mentioned that I was a candidate, and I experienced that myself. I was a candidate for state senate in California, and from an independent expenditure group, which in this case happened to be a lot of unions, spent over 4 million, that was getting close to outrageous, $4 million to say, because I did not believe, I'm a lawyer, I don't believe in recall of judges. There was a judge in Santa Clara County where I was running who had been recalled because of giving what people thought, while it was a legal decision that he made and it was within the amount, he gave too little of a jail term to a Stanford student because he had been involved in some sexual activity with a young woman, and while she was passed out, but because I didn't believe in recalls, and he did what was legal and within the law, it seemed inappropriate to me. But this $4 million ran campaigns both on television as well as in various pieces of material that showed up, and it was COVID, so they couldn't go to people's houses, but it was tons of mail sent daily saying that I supported rapists, which clearly I did not support rapists. And there's not a way to change that narrative, and people believe it. So this also, I mean, just to add to this, of course, when the people get elected, they are clearly beholden to those major donors and to those groups. There is no question about it. And therefore, for them, they're not going to really be representing the people that they're supposed to be representing. They're going to be representing their own personal interests because of those major donors and organizations. And there isn't any doubt about it. It's very well known, including amount of money in politics that comes from lobbying as well. So the election then ends up being an election about litmus tests, and there's no room for real discussion about issues. So I'd say because of deregulated campaign finance, people really have much less ability to influence the issues that they care about in their communities, and it prevents an open dialogue as well.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting because some of the arguments for money in politics, for example, in the Citizens United case itself, was that the money in politics is the same as someone's voice, and by limiting it, you're limiting discussion and you're limiting the discourse. But as we've seen in the 11 years since then, it doesn't increase the discourse. It actually causes the issues not to even be discussed, really, because it's all broken down to this this battle between misinformation. John, please go ahead and...
Yeah, I thought I'd go there because I can maybe add a little different perspective. I think that Ann did a great job at describing the problem. And by the way, I think Tim, if anything, understated the problem in rural America with news and how it was decimated with less than half many people in newsrooms, and all the rural people got cut out, and how big of a problem that is for society when you don't know what's happening in your own neighborhood. So you get all caught up on what's on TV happening a long way from you. But when you focus on fixing, I mean, it was a good explanation of the problem, but we got to be careful about how we fix it. So before Citizens United, there was McCain-Feingold, and that was the idea of saying, you know, political parties have too much money. Let's try to control that. And the argument against it at the time was that if you do that, the money is going to go another route. At least the parties are motivated to have a governing majority. And then what happened after McCain-Feingold was that a lot of the money went to the more extreme groups. They didn't care about governing majority. They just cared about their particular issue. So in that case, the kind of default, oh, there's too much money, let's regulate and limit it, actually made the rule actually made the situation worse. And so we had to be very careful about just saying, oh, and talking for like 90% of the time about the problem and saying, therefore we need a regulation to fix it. Because sometimes the actual consequence of that regulation, depending on how it works, can actually have the opposite effect. Now, I'm a little bit less optimistic about my ability to change what happens directly. Convincing politicians to pass good regulation that doesn't, I mean, we may come up with the right solution, but what they actually pass will probably support whatever party has the power at the time. So that concerns me. And I mean, if you really limit political speech or paid speech, there is too much money in there. But then you're just really increasing the power of the press. And some people might consider that the strongest super PAC of them all, if the press thinks one point of view. So I'm not sure. What I do think can work, and has worked in history, is essentially we move back to a time of yellow journalism, where a lot of people say things that aren't true and they're fighting it. The idea of having a trusted center media source was Walter Cronkite. This is the way it is. And that's actually an aberration in history. Before then, it was always broken apart. There were all sorts of different organizations, and people knew that this piece from Benjamin Franklin versus this piece from the Tories, or this piece from Common Sense, Sammy Adams, that they all had their own opinion. So when you read it, you knew the bias. You actually took what they said with a grain of salt. And you also knew the other points of view because your neighbor, who you helped get a plow out of their field the other day, was reading the other thing. And so even though you thought that those other points of view were wrong, you heard them. And we had a relationship with the other person. We had relationships with people on the other side, because until you have a relationship with somebody who has a different point of view, you don't listen to them, no matter what logic there is. If we're cut off emotionally from each other, where more people are concerned about somebody marrying somebody in the wrong party than anything else, it's a huge national problem. And if you have that emotive thing to not listen to the other person, it doesn't matter whether it's a good point of view or not. So the really only way to do that is to get us out of those filter bubbles, to get us out of relationship bubbles, have us introduced to more ideas and to more people, and then using technology to kind of help people. We just need to get people the tools to get through the crap. I don't think we can regulate out junk. I don't think we can regulate out crap. I don't think we can regulate out disinformation. There's a lot of disinformation before. Now we just have more power to do it more powerfully. What we can do is, with technology and education, empower individual people to fight through all that crap, to know the difference, to be able to get through it, to give them the tools so they can see the different points of view, to meet the different people, understand the different people. And though I do think there are some rules I definitely would like to change, I do think there are some possibilities with regulation and changing regulation that can help. I wouldn't put all our cards in that bucket, because it may not come out the way we want, and it's too slow. I am an internet guy. Things happen more quickly. By the time the regulation's passed, the problem has changed. And so I think the real thing comes down to us, to educating ourselves, our kids, our neighbors, and giving them the tools to fight through that information, to fight through those bubbles. And that will at least give a little bit more level playing field, not to a perfect place, but to a better place, so that we can make better decisions as a society.
Yeah, that's really interesting you brought that up, John, because Tim and I were in the green room a little earlier and we're discussing just this thing. Because I was talking about, working with American Promise. One of our goals in communications is to lift up a lot of voices and a lot of perspectives, and for people to be taught telling their own story about how does, we focused on the issue of money in politics, how does this affect you? People come at it from a bunch of different points of view, and hearing those points of view from them helps develop that relationship. And then Tim and I were talking about the exact same thing. So I'd love, Tim, if you could talk some about how you've seen that. But we were saying, people having a connection with each other, and this comes back to the local reporting too, I think, where you have a relationship with your news source, even that's a closer relationship in the community. So I'd love to hear, Tim, if you have some thoughts on this, many perspectives and knowing each other more personally.
Oh, you're on mute.
Oh yeah, you're
on mute. Done that. You cannot have a panel meeting without somebody being unmuted.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be able to fulfill that responsibility and do it so well and with such talent. In a small town, it is possible for the scale is different. I know people in my town of 1,500 generally. I don't go squealing through the middle, through the downtown of Norris, Tennessee, at 80 miles an hour with impunity, the way I like to in Knoxville, for example. I'm accountable in a different way because people know me personally. I think that and that's great. And I joke that I can't afford to irritate my mechanic because I don't want to drive 20 miles to get my oil changed. But how does that scale to an international level? And how do you make the comments? We've had these things of, John, when you were talking, forgive me, I'm thinking of sort of like Joe versus the pack instead of the volcano. How do you turn the comments section into something that's accountable? And I know there are tools for that. Where people are mutually accountable to each other in the way that we would be in real time in a real space. And my neighbor literally pulls me out of the ditch, our kids are in school together. How do you take that, and we're in church together, how do you take that kind of relationship structure that doesn't constrain speech as much as it shapes it in a way that becomes more positive? People know where I stand politically, and I don't have to hide that. But the anger is new, and the anger and vitriol that I feel sometimes from people is a new phenomenon, and I do attribute that to the anonymity of the internet. So my question would be, how do we take that accountability and reshape it in a way that gets us to scale at a national level? I don't have an answer for that. I just know that I know how it works in a smaller community, and I like that about a smaller community.
Yeah. I love that question. That is the right question. And there's so Anne wants to ask a different question, but I'm working with some groups working on that very thing. Do you want to say something first, Anne? I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that I think that would be the ideal way for us to deal with this problem, but it's going to be so long term. And personally,
I think it doesn't have to be that long term.
It will.
I'm excited about a possibility.
I love the possibilities. However, I don't think that we will deal with some of that vitriol, the anonymity that it provides for people to say, misogynist, disgusting things to an old lady like me. I mean, seriously. So I personally think that what we now are facing needs urgent resolution. And yes, I agree that journalism is a huge factor, and local journalism. But frankly, I think we need to have laws that are going to require at least greater transparency and some other ideas I have. But seriously, we have seen in the last few years how terrible the impacts on our democracy around the world, not just in the United States, around the world, and causing in some countries, and I know this because I've had conversations with people today in Mexico and El Salvador, totalitarianism and unbelievable behaviors. And that a lot of this comes because of the false information being spread on the internet that people believe. And it's not going to change in worldwide with people just, trying to
let's talk about how do you tangibly fix this problem in a realistic, scalable, numerical way. When you talk to academics about movements, and by movement, we're talking about anything in a society or group of people that become so popular that policies change, that culture changes, that everything changes. And they say when you get about 3.5% of that populace engaged in one idea, if that's all you need, that's a critical mass you need. Sometimes you don't need that much, but when you get that many, things change. And so when you talk about 300 million Americans, you're talking about whether you're counting registered voters or people of age, it's between 5 and 8 million people you need to engage in some activity. Now, I'm not saying you're going to stop the extremes. We're focusing on the wrong thing. Think about the adoption curve. You have a few people adopt something early on, innovators, and then you have a bigger group that early adopters. Well, that's a tiny part of the overall curve, is 3.5%. And actually, one thing I loved about Biden's inaugural speech, is that he spoke about we just need enough of us. So you don't have to get the people who are rude to misogynist or racist or people who think everybody who doesn't believe in them aren't woke and therefore evil, or pick whatever extreme you don't like. They actually don't matter. What we have to do is empower. I mean, I don't want to overstate that, but the thing we have to focus on are that people the 3.5 to 5% of the people we need to enable to vote based on a better solution, to communicate with each other. And coming from Netscape and from Microsoft earlier than that with the original Office team, 5 to 8 million people, that's a very doable number. And part of what you do goes straight to Tim's point of view about anonymity. So there are several organizations, a lot of nonprofits, as well as for-profit companies, USA Today, Gannett, and Yahoo News. They're promoting something in June, middle of June, called America Talks. And we're helping use the technology so we automatically connect people who are opposite politically on one-on-one conversations, that they follow a guide and they begin to hear each other. If we just give the 70% of people nationwide who think that division and polarization is a crisis level problem, I'm sorry, 63% of the people nationwide who think that's true. If we just give enough of them the tools to understand each other, to break through the noise and to understand each other, and give people more opportunities to connect in a real way where they can see the other person rather than being anonymous, that's enough to move 3.5 to 4% of Americans. And with that, you change policy, you change culture, you make a true impact. So I'm a math guy. And so I'm looking at the tangible numbers of what it'll take to shift our society so we do make better decisions for everybody. I think it's very doable. And I don't think it's really, so I do think there are lots of things we could do in lots of ways to help. But I think it's a very doable thing.
I want to jump to some questions just before we end, because there are several coming through. And I also wanted to, so one was just what solutions the media can do to help bring people together. I think we've talked about that some. I did want to have just briefly a moment for you, Anne and John, both to talk about sort of your passion for civic education. You both are involved in that. American Promise is also highly involved in educating people around how government works, what people can do to affect change. And so I would love to just very briefly, if we can, because we only have like 4 or 5 minutes left, talk about that, please.
It won't take too long. I think one of the other problems that we see is that people really do not understand government. They don't understand how it works, how complex it is, and also how you have to generally accede to the other side and to try to find a balanced solution to things. And that's something that people now don't seem to appreciate. They are on one side or the other, but also how to have a voice in government and how to sort of make a difference in government. And I think that teaching civics is really important, and in some way trying to do that for adults as well, because we know that a lot of civics education has not been provided to a lot of young people or people who are already adults over the years. And it really needs to be sort of as John was talking about, where people can talk to each other and to try to understand other viewpoints and recognize how you can make changes in government yourselves. And I also think, as was said, that people do need to learn from civics education as well, how to recognize bias and how to recognize falsehoods, and to try to deliberate with one another. And so that is something that I think is really important. And I want to put in a plug to an organization that I'm on the board that started with Justice O'Connor, and now Justice Sotomayor is on it, and it's iCivics. They are working all the time and with other organizations in a consortium to try to increase civics education.
I was about to plug iCivics as well, and Anne's role with that is I didn't know you were on the board of that. It's a fabulous organization, and I love the fact that notice that Anne isn't talking just about the three branches of government, but also how to talk with each other across differences. That skill set is what makes our democratic republic possible. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is also something educators really want to teach. It's part of social emotional learning. It's part of what you need to know in life. And media doesn't talk about it. That's not very good because it's not very disruptive or upsetting. So you're not going to get a lot of popular media covering that. But that is what we need in life. And I do think that coming from a small town like Tim, it's easier to find in smaller towns in the bigger cities where things get so busy that you don't know your neighbors as well. And that makes the training of that skill set even more important. I'll also do a pitch for another nonprofit called All Sides for Schools. That's I'm involved with that nonprofit. And we've worked with iCivics. We love them. But we're actually focused on that news literacy part, identifying bias, and also matching students across areas. So we call it mismatch, but we had some students in Utah in a high school talk online video with some students in urban New York. And the students in Utah were like, oh my gosh, you're using colorful language, because they were cussing in New York, and in their school they could get kicked out for cuss words. And then the students in New York were like amazed at this incredible vistas and hillsides behind the Utah students. Forgetting politics, just having these students recognize and be amazed by the other lives they had. That's an important part of life. And there's a lot more human connection involved with what we're dealing with and what we're hoping for than people recognize. And I think that we can bring that back. We can do that. And I think actually technology can help it. We're building technology for schools to make that easy for them to see each other in person and talk with each other one-on-one, as opposed to in some kind of anonymous, terrible Twitter kind of way.
Yeah. And I think, we feel like we're all kind of pointing to this concentration of power, concentration of wealth, big national, multinational things telling our stories for us, not talking to each other as a really fundamental issue that's shifting the way we talk. And American Promise, of course, grassroots organization trying to bring people from every type of background together to talk about this, to work on something together. So I think we just need to finish up. I would love to hear last parting words from each of you, sort of how you think we can most effectively have these conversations, foster these conversations. What are the most important things that myself as an individual can do, what you can do, what your neighbors can do. Tim, we'll start with you. Parting words, please.
Well, I'm not as big on talking as I am on doing. And I think people really need to do things together. Build houses together for habitat, worship together in church, support their kids at the basketball game or the soccer game. That I think we get to know each other well and trust each other when the conversation is not about politics or these high stakes conversations.
Wonderful, thank you, John. Let's go to you next. Thoughts.
I love what Tim said because it's so correct. And I know an area, I can't remember which city it was, but they were having difficulty with police and the local community. And they were going to have a big town hall meeting. Instead, the policemen had a cookout with everybody, and that really resolved things. And that's, we've got to get past this objectifying people based on their politics or on their race or ethnicity, or whether they're rural or urban or red or blue or green or purple or whatever, and just meet each other as human beings. Things begin to change there. And I completely appreciate what Anne was pointing out earlier. It's like, hey, can we really do that at scale? And I think that's the only thing that does solve the problem. And I think that technology can make that scalable. The first round of internet technology did the opposite. I think the next round of internet technology can actually make that easier. And I think we can bring that to a lot of people, enable people, because even despite all our human tendencies to want to divide and think of stereotypes, it's also in our human nature to want to connect and appreciate each other as people. And we can design technologies that lean into that as opposed to lean in the other. And so I think that we have that possibility. And I'm actually happy in a weird way where we are, because we're now aware of the problem. I think this problem's been around for a while. It's been getting worse and worse. And just like an alcoholic, you can't get better until you bottom out and understand there's a problem. We now understand there's a problem. I think we can solve it.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Anne, final parting words from you, please.
Well, let me just say about what John just said, because I am really excited that that's true if he thinks that technology is going to be able to do those things. Because what we now have, of course, is technology companies, platforms whose business model is to push out the more extreme kind of information. And that's where I absolutely agree with him that that is something I'd love to see. But at the moment, we don't have that. And we need to have citizens working together. And I'm totally in agreement with that about, trying to improve public discourse, trying to expand their involvement in both local government issues as well as state and federal government issues, including by, contacting their congresspeople and senators and saying that you should vote for certain things, but also try to, really tell them, because to go back to my passion about campaign finance and the interrelationship of it to all of these things, people need to stand up. And that issue is nonpartisan. The polling has shown that people across the country, both Republicans, Democrats, and independents, feel that they don't have a voice in our government because of money in politics. People need to take that to heart and let people know that in government that that's something they're concerned about.
Absolutely, yes. And I get the final shameless plug because I'm the moderator. American Promise, if you're part of this event and you aren't already part of American Promise, please go to americanpromise.net. All of the things we've talked about, we're working on an amendment to end the domination of money in politics, but also a